Summer 1943. Berlin was a city that no longer slept, but not from joy. Its nights glowed with a sickly orange haze as searchlights combed the sky and anti-aircraft guns thundered like war drums. The Reich's capital was still standing, but the mood inside the chancellery was already brittle, like porcelain cracked but not yet shattered. On the morning of March 17th, a rain-soaked officer from the WWII arrived at Wilhelmstrasse carrying a leather satchel. The man's boots left a trail of wet prints across the marble hallways as if mocking a crime scene. Inside that satchel was a report that would, in the eyes of some, end the war before it was over. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the weary spymaster of the German intelligence service, stood by the window of his office, fingers wrapped around a cigarette he hadn't yet lit. Canaris was a man who kept secrets the way a priest kept confessions, but even he looked unsettled as the courier entered. He took the satchel with a nod, opened it, and spread the documents on his desk. The rain kept dripping from the officer's cap, tapping the floor like a clock counting down. "Even the enemy's silence," Canaris murmured, "is beginning to sound like thunder." The report laid out the state of the war as seen through the eyes of spies scattered from Lisbon to Stockholm. It was not the kind of news the Führer liked to hear. Germany's armies were still deep inside the Soviet Union, but the bloodletting at Stalingrad had left the Wehrmacht staggering. The WWII's networks reported that America's industrial machine had shifted into overdrive, churning out nearly 90,000 aircraft in a single year, crating tanks and trucks by the tens of thousands, launching Liberty ships so quickly it looked like a magic trick. The report described the factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh as if they were living beasts. Sparks flew from welders like tiny war fireworks, conveyor belts hummed like a hive of bees, and swing music from factory radios floated over the roar of machinery. Even at night, the plants were lit so brightly they could be spotted from the air, shining like cities that refused to sleep. And then there were the convoys. 6 months earlier, U-boats had been terrorizing the Atlantic, sinking Allied shipping faster than Britain could replace it. But now, the trend was reversing. Convoy losses were falling. Allied escorts were using radar and Huff-Duff direction finding to hunt U-boats, and new escort carriers turned the ocean into a floating airfield. The hunters were becoming the hunted. Colonel Hans Oster, Canaris's trusted deputy, leaned over the map spread across the table. He traced a line from New York to Liverpool with his finger. "They are not just feeding Britain," Oster said. "They are preparing for something larger. An invasion, perhaps, within a year." Canaris nodded grimly. The report included numbers, but it was the tone of the field agents that chilled them more. One spy in Sweden wrote, "The Americans behave as if they have already won. Their factories never stop, their morale never wavers. Even their rations contain Coca-Cola. It seems they plan to win in comfort." Another, operating out of Switzerland, sent a dry aside that made Canaris almost smile. "If production continues at this pace, they will soon have enough planes to give one to every farm boy in Iowa." The humor faded quickly. The numbers could not be argued with. If this pace kept up, the war's outcome was no longer in doubt. The last page of the report was blunt. It warned that if current trends continued for 6 more months, Germany would no longer be able to replace its losses. The Reich would be fighting with dwindling fuel, dwindling steel, and eventually dwindling men. Canaris closed the file, his face unreadable. "This," he said softly, "is what we have feared." He signed the forwarding slip with his neat naval handwriting. The report was to be delivered directly to the Reich Chancellery, straight to Hitler's desk. Outside, the rain kept falling, drumming on the windows like the sound of distant artillery. Somewhere in Berlin, a church bell told the hour. Later that evening, the courier walked through the corridors of the Führer's headquarters, leather satchel still damp, boots echoing in the stone hallway. Guards stepped aside as the document was carried into the war room. Inside, maps of Europe stretched across the walls. Red arrows still pointed eastward, toward the Soviet Union, but everyone in the room knew the momentum had shifted. The courier placed the report on the polished desk. A clock ticked loudly. The Reich's leader had not read it yet. But when he did, it would unleash a storm. And this was only the beginning. Night on the North Atlantic was a living thing. Black waves heaving like the breath of some ancient beast, moonlight glinting off their backs like the flash of knives. In March 1943, convoy HX 229 plowed through those waters, 38 ships heavy with wheat, oil, trucks, and the quiet hope of 2 continents. Smoke trailed from their stacks, forming a ghostly line across the sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen eyes were watching. 40 German U-boats moved in for the kill. They had done this before, slipping like wolves through the dark, attacking from all sides, torpedoes flashing like underwater lightning. Until recently, these wolf packs had been death itself, scattering convoys, turning the Atlantic into a graveyard of steel. But this night would be different. The convoy was ready. Above the waves, radar-equipped liberators prowled the skies, their searchlights like white spears cutting through the mist. On the water, destroyers zigzagged with practiced precision, depth charges primed and ready. Every man aboard knew the statistics. Too many convoys had been shredded before, but this night the odds were no longer on the hunter's side. The first contact came just after midnight. A U-boat surfaced to fire, its periscope glinting like a needle in the moonlight. Within seconds, an escort destroyer swung toward it, guns barking, tracers stitching the night. The submarine dove, but it was too late. The sea erupted in a column of water as depth charges went off, lifting the bow of the U-boat before splitting it open like a tin toy. When the water closed again, oil and bodies floated to the surface. One after another, the wolves were driven off or sunk. Aztec sonar, once unreliable, now found them with eerie accuracy. Radio direction finders pinpointed their transmissions before they could even attack. The men on the convoy ships watched in awe as the ocean itself seemed to turn traitor against their enemy. A U-boat survivor later recalled, "We were the hunters, but that night, the ocean turned against us. It felt as if we were fighting not just the enemy, but the sea itself." Above, a British Liberator swooped low, its lee light stabbing the waves. The crew cheered as their bombs struck home, the blast lighting the night like a firework display. An American sailor on one of the freighters wrote home later, "It was like watching the night light up just for us. Only these fireworks meant somebody wasn't coming back." By dawn, 13 U-boats were gone, 13 in a single convoy battle, a number that stunned even the most hardened Allied captains. The North Atlantic, once a hunting ground, was now a killing ground for the hunters themselves. In Berlin, when the news reached Admiral Donitz, he reportedly stared at the figures for a long time before muttering, "If this continues, the U-boat arm will be annihilated." His staff said he looked 10 years older that morning. The WWII compiled the results into another report, grimly noting that Allied shipping losses had fallen below replacement levels. Britain's lifeline would hold. American men, machines, and food would keep pouring into the island like an unbroken tide. The Battle of the Atlantic, the very war for survival, was tipping. Some German officers tried to laugh it off, saying the Allies must have trained the whales to betray the submarines, or that Poseidon himself had switched sides. But the humor rang hollow. The numbers were relentless, and even the most loyal officers could see that something fundamental had shifted. When Canaris read the summary, he placed it quietly on his desk and stared at the rain streaking his window. He had been a naval officer once, and he knew what it meant when a navy lost control of the sea. "If the sea is lost," he said to Oster, "then the war is lost." The next packet of intelligence was prepared, sealed, and sent along the same route as the first. This one carried a warning: if Allied production and convoy protection continued at this rate, an invasion of occupied Europe was no longer just possible, it was inevitable. And then came a set of numbers from across the Atlantic that made every man in the room sit a little straighter. The reports no longer spoke of future production goals. They spoke of production so vast it was already reshaping the war. The next revelation would shake Berlin more than sinking submarines ever could. If the Atlantic had given German intelligence a nightmare, America's factories turned that nightmare into a waking reality. Reports trickled in through neutral ports, coded in invisible ink, smuggled in hollowed-out books. They all painted the same picture. The United States had become a single, roaring engine, and every piston was aimed at Germany. Night in Michigan was not dark at all. The Ford Willow Run plant blazed with so much light it could have guided lost aircraft home from the sky. Inside, 1,000 machines clattered and hissed, sparks flying like fireflies. The air smelled of oil, sweat, and hot metal. Workers moved in steady rhythm, hands calloused, faces streaked with grime, as if part of one great living organism. Every 63 minutes, another B-24 Liberator bomber rolled off the line. 63 minutes. The numbers shocked even the spies who had risked their lives to get them. One German agent in Lisbon wrote with disbelief, "They are building aircraft the way we build bread rolls." The reports tallied the scale. America had produced 48,000 aircraft the year before, but 1943 was already running ahead of schedule. 8,000 planes a month, nearly 2,000 tanks, tens of thousands of trucks. Ammunition poured out by the millions of rounds. The country's industrial might was not just keeping pace with losses, it was outproducing them by a margin that no Axis power could match. One WWII officer reportedly set down the file, rubbed his temples, and muttered, "It is not war anymore, it is arithmetic." The image of this country as a war machine fascinated and terrified German analysts. They described Detroit's assembly lines as veins and arteries pumping steel and fire. They wrote of Pittsburgh's steel mills belching smoke so thick it turned noon into dusk, of women riveters whose laughter echoed through the hangars even as they built weapons to kill their sons and brothers at the front. Canaris read one such report aloud to Oster. "Even at night, the factories glow like a second sun. The nation has no darkness left, it has turned itself into daylight to work more quickly." For a moment, the spymaster allowed himself a bitter smile. "The Americans wage war and still find time to dance," he said, pointing to a note about factory swing bands playing Benny Goodman during shifts. The remark was meant to be wry, but it landed like a stone in the room. Another report contained what the Germans considered a small act of psychological cruelty, a description of American workers complaining about the taste of coffee in their break rooms. "Even under total war," the agent wrote, "they behave as if life must remain comfortable. They plan to win and stay civilized while doing it." The humor was thin, and the fear beneath it was palpable. The final intelligence summary of March 17 was stark. If production continues at this rate, the Reich cannot replace its losses. The war is no longer winnable by military means. The phrase, "no longer winnable," carried a kind of electric charge. When the document reached Berlin, it was stamped and initialed by several officers who rarely agreed on anything. Some argued the figures had to be exaggerated, propaganda meant to shake German morale. But the sources were solid, and the agents who gathered the information had never failed before. Canaris knew the report would reach the Reich Chancellery within hours. He also knew what it would do to the man who read it. Hitler did not tolerate bad news. That night, as Berlin's air raid sirens began their mournful wail and people rushed to shelters, Canaris stood alone at his office window. The city's searchlights crisscrossed the sky like impatient swords. Somewhere far above, bombers were coming. Oster entered quietly. "Do you think he'll believe it?" "He will believe it," Canaris said. "But he will call it betrayal." Outside, the first explosions rolled across the city like distant thunder. The air smelled of smoke again. The report, thick with numbers, heavy as a verdict, was on its way to the Führer's desk. When he read it, the storm would break. The war room at the Wolf's Lair was too warm for March, stifling with cigarette smoke and tension. Maps covered every wall, red arrows stretching like claws toward Moscow, Kursk, and the Caucasus. A single lamp burned over the long oak table, throwing a harsh yellow circle of light on the documents stacked in front of Adolf Hitler. He had been reading for 10 minutes, though it felt longer. Each page he turned landed with a flat, dry slap that made the men in the room flinch. Canaris stood at attention, hands behind his back, eyes unreadable. Hans Oster was beside him, boots clicking softly on the concrete floor as he shifted his weight. Hitler set the last page down, stared at it for a long moment, and then slammed his fist on the table hard enough to make the inkwell jump. "Lies!" he barked. "This is defeatism. Propaganda. Do you think I don't see what you are doing, Canaris?" The spymaster did not move. "Mein Führer," he said evenly, "these reports come from multiple agents, from multiple sources. They are not exaggerations. They are facts." Around the table, the generals exchanged tense glances. Keitel's jaw was set like stone. Jodl said nothing. They had all seen the convoys grow stronger, the bombing raids heavier. The numbers might be unwelcome, but they were not wrong. Hitler rose from his chair and began pacing. His voice rose and fell, part rant, part sermon. He spoke of miracle weapons, of U-boats still prowling the Atlantic, of the iron will of the German people. But the words sounded thinner than they had a year ago, and everyone in the room could feel it. Canaris let the tirade wash over him. He had survived enough of these meetings to know that arguing now would be pointless. But Oster leaned closer and whispered, "He doesn't believe his own words anymore." The clock on the wall ticked, loud enough to sound like a metronome for the entire Reich. Every tick was a reminder that time was not on their side. When Hitler finally stopped pacing, he returned to the table and placed his hands flat on the map. "We will not speak of this report again," he said coldly. "Our enemies will break before we do." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. The room felt it too. The silence that followed was heavier than the rant that came before it. Canaris gave a curt nod, gathered the papers, and turned to leave. Outside in the corridor, Oster caught his arm. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked quietly. "Yes," Canaris replied. "This is the day the war is lost. The rest is just dying slowly." That night, the Wolf's Lair was quiet except for the distant howl of dogs and the steady ticking of the hall clocks. Canaris stood alone in the cold, his breath fogging in the air, listening. Somewhere far away, the guns on the Eastern Front thundered. Somewhere over Berlin, British bombers droned through the night sky. The Reich was still standing, still fighting, but something invisible had shifted. The men who knew how wars were measured, by steel, by fuel, by bread, by time, understood what had happened that day. Germany had not yet surrendered, but its spies had already seen the surrender written in the smoke over Detroit, in the convoy wakes across the Atlantic, and in the factory lights that turned America into a sleepless giant. The clocks kept ticking in the Wolf's Lair, each second like a hammer striking iron. And from that day on, every tick sounded like a countdown.